Hello, today is April 21st of 2021. My name is Jonathan Alvarado and I'm interviewing Yendy Rebollo for the Voces Oral History Center at the University of Texas at Austin. Please know, Yendy Rebollo, that this recorded interview will be placed in the Nettie Lee Benson Latin American Collection at the University of Texas at Austin and the Brown University's Library Digital Repository. If there is anything you do not wish to answer or talk about, I will honor your wishes. Also, if there is a topic that you want to talk about, please bring it up and we can discuss it. Participation in this study is completely voluntary and you are free to withdraw from the interview at any time. Because we are not conducting this interview in person, I need to record you consenting to participate in this interview. I'll ask you a series of 5 questions. Please say, yes, I agree, or no, I do not agree after each one. Voces of a Pandemic wishes to archive your interview along with any other photographs and other documentation that you wish to contribute at the Benson Library at UT Austin and Brown University's digital repository. The Voices Oral History Project will retain copyright of the interview and any other materials that you choose to donate. So 1, do you give the Voices of Pandemic Project consent to archive your interview and your materials at the Benson Library and Brown University digital repository?
Yes.
2, do you grant the Voices of a Pandemic Project copyright over the interview and any material you choose to provide?
Yes.
3, do you agree to allow the Voices of a Pandemic to post this interview on the internet via Voices Oral History Center's YouTube channel where it may be viewed by the public?
Yes.
Okay. We have many questions in a pre-interview form that we have already filled out. We use that information from the pre-interview form to help in this research. This entire form is kept in a secure server at the University of Texas at Austin. Before we send your information from the pre-interview form to the Benson Library, we would have stripped out any contact information for yourself or your family members, so that will not be a part of your public profile. Your public profile will be accessible at the Benson Library. Do you wish for us to share the rest of your interview in your public profile to researchers at the Benson Library?
Yeah.
On the occasion, the Voices Oral History Center receives requests from journalists who wish to contact individuals who have participated as narrators in oral history interviews. The Voices Oral History Center only responds to reputable news outlets. Do you give consent for Voices to share your phone number or email with journalists that are interested in your story?
Yes.
Okay, so thank you for agreeing to the preamble / informed consent. We'll go ahead and start the interview. So the first question I have for you today is, when and how did you first hear about COVID-19?
Yeah, so I first heard about it on the Berkeley campus, as you can tell my backdrop. I was studying for a class, and I think I actually had that class later on, and I'm pretty sure it was March 13th, like a random Tuesday or Friday. And all my friends started freaking out. Everybody started packing up their stuff. Like, my best friends were like, sorry, like, we can't hang out today. Like, we have to pack all our stuff. And it was pretty hectic, actually, because it was just going like a normal day. And then it was just like suddenly like culture shock of like, everybody's leaving and like, you gotta go, you gotta get off campus.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess a follow-up to that is, what were your initial impressions of the news?
I think that as someone that has, with my background and being low income, it's really hard to be shocked by certain things sometimes. Like, I'm really desensitized to things that would be shocking. Nonetheless, I was still pretty shaken up because of it. It forced me to like not see my friends anymore. I was like, wait, what do you mean you guys are going down to LA already? Everybody's going back home. I was like, I'm here alone. Like, it just kind of was very very abrupt. That's what it is. That's the word that I was looking for. It was very abrupt. And I think that even though I'm typically desensitized to a lot of things, that still hit pretty impressively.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely, it was definitely a major shift. And I know you mentioned a little bit about how other people in your campus community reacted. How about other people in your broader community? What type of reactions did you notice from them?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's definitely different when you look at people that are in academia and people that are not.
Mm-hmm.
Um, a lot of a lot of my friends, a lot of my peers, in school and out of school, like work. What's the word for it? They work essential jobs. And so the pandemic for them looks a little different than it would for like a student that's solely focused on academics, or not working a job or being able to rely off financial aid. So for my community that isn't in academia and is in Richmond or San Pablo, um, it's having to see them work every day and not get any financial assistance of that sort. A lot of them are undocumented, so they don't get like the stimulus. They don't qualify for unemployment. So it's definitely been seeing different worlds collide, in my perspective, because I've seen some of my peers at Cal being able to just quarantine straight home, like never leave their house unless they have to. And then you see like frontline essential workers that cannot even afford to stay home. So it's been pretty hectic. I think it's taking a toll on my mental health a little bit, but yeah.
Definitely, I definitely hear that, and it's yeah, it was a lot. Um, and I know you mentioned a little bit about the toll that it's taken on you. Do you think you can talk some more about your own general experience with COVID-19? It could be, we could start off pretty broad and then we'll go a little bit more deeper into certain aspects of how it's impacted you. In general, what would you say your experience has been?
Oh, that's a little tough because it's pretty vague.
Yeah.
But I think that it's definitely taken a toll physically, mentally, and even academically. And I'll get into each in a second, but the reason I think academically is because it is so different doing university on my laptop and teaching myself everything from home. Like, in a sense, I'm paying thousands of dollars to teach myself at home, right? Um, but above that, it's also gave me, and I don't know if like, you feel this way, or if this is a commonality thing, but Zoom fatigue
Yeah.
is so real. And I think after being in classes and in work meetings and also trying to study with my friends over Zoom, like you end up spending, or at least I end up spending, sorry, let me rephrase, I end up spending about at least like 8 hours on my laptop. And that's really damaging to my physical health, because it deprives me from like going outside, getting some vitamin D. It stops me from, getting to enjoy like reading. Like, it's kind of having to read on your laptop all the time has taken such a toll on my eyes that like I used to read for fun, right? And I don't think that I have done that in such a long time because academia has kind of taken that from me. Um, or rather, it feels like a chore after being on Zoom for so long.
Yeah.
I think that's kind of how it's been affecting my academics. Like, I'm still doing fine, um, but I don't want to. Like, I feel burnt out. Like, I'm at the point where I'm just like, another project, another paper, more research, like doing it entirely all on my laptop, like group projects too, even. Berkeley has been a fan of making group projects a thing, even though we're not in person. And it's been such a hassle in some ways. I've learned a lot. I think I have, like I I think I'm more resilient, like it's taught me a lot, but I think also like it's affected me negatively a lot.
Yeah. Yeah, I definitely,
Yeah.
especially after a year of doing this continuously at this type of rigor, um, I definitely see where you're coming from. And I guess even before that, before you started noticing some of the concerns or some of the effects that it's had on your like mental and physical health and just like overall well-being, were there any initial concerns about the pandemic? Whether they turned out to be like um, whether those concerns ended up like coming to fruition or whether other concerns like took over. What were your like first, I guess, what were your first initial concerns?
My very first one was, am I going to be able to work and how will I feed myself?
Mhm.
And I think that can kind of be, I don't want to say common, but it can probably be seen amongst undocumented folks
Mhm.
and first generation low income folks, because being in a situation where you're already kind of having like financial scarcity, and then having a pandemic thrown into that, you're just kind of like, before my employer said like we're still going to be working remotely, I almost had a panic attack because at the time I was only working one job. So now I'm working two jobs. But at the time I was only relying on this one job. And even though being a college advisor pays the bills, I was wondering like, how am I still going to be able to do that job if I can't be on site on school campus? Will they even want to like continue paying us? Because I think for the first 2 weeks they still paid us without having us work.
Mhm.
And so that was kind of like a calming aspect of it. I was like, okay, like at least as an employer, like the company's trying to take care of us. But it could have looked so different had I not been a college advisor. Like if I would have had a job at Starbucks or I don't know, something else. I could have been, a lot of people were like left with no jobs and
Yeah.
having to be put on unemployment. And that would of course look different for me, because I think I'm not 100% sure on the legalities of it now, but I'm pretty sure DACA students um, were and were not available to get unemployment. Like it was on a very case by case basis and depending on your employer. Um, but just the idea of having to figure that out is like an additional stress that or sent me like spiraling for a second, Um, it was one of my biggest worries at the beginning. But I truffled through. I budgeted. And that's usually like, you can't really budget yourself out of poverty, but you can budget for survival. And I think that's something that's not really discussed. But initially, those were my biggest worries. And then my second one was, how am I going to get any help for like tutoring or like any of those on campus resources? Like, I think I mentioned it a little earlier where I talked about reading on my laptop. That was easier on me when I was on campus because we had resources like the Multicultural Community Center. And through the MCC, you were able to get at least 10 printed copies, 10
Mhm.
printed pages every day. And so if say you had two readings and both of them were double-sided 4 pages, you could get them printed there. And I think that's had such a big impact at the beginning of the pandemic, because I didn't have those resources and I didn't have a printer and I couldn't just, so it definitely took that toll in the beginning. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. And I really like your emphasis on the different ways in which you had to learn to survive throughout COVID, not just avoiding like getting COVID, but just in general, like financially, academically. So I really appreciate that. Um, and I know you mentioned some of these concerns, such as just like academically, like how you'd academically how would you would able to manage the same amount of coursework through this like completely different setting. Was there a certain point where these concerns became legitimized? Was there like a certain day that you realized that like this is this is just hard, like, and it's hard and it shouldn't be this hard?
Yeah, definitely. I was last semester, I was taking a Spanish course and I was managing to do well enough in my other classes, and I just couldn't with this one. And it was so upsetting because Spanish is my first language.
Yeah.
Um, but this was also different from like Spanish that I learned at home or Spanish that I, went over in high school. And, I didn't think I was too I don't want to say out of shape because it's not, language isn't something you get in shape for, but I didn't feel like I was too out of practice to take the course because I had, taken AP Spanish, I had taken AP Spanish literature and I liked it. I would read Spanish books every now and then. I listened to Spanish music because, it's part of my background. But I could not with this class. Like my papers weren't academically developed enough for my professor. It felt like every homework assignment, he wasn't just grading it on completion, he was like grading it for what you were giving. And it was very tough trying to, one, not catch COVID. So using like hand sanitizer everywhere I went, keeping my mask on. I got fully vaccinated recently, so I'm definitely taking all the precautions that I can. But having to worry about not catching COVID, wearing your mask, going to work, trying to keep like a sane mental health, and then also trying to like please these almost seeming like unrealistic expectations from this professor. And I like went to office hours and I sat down with him and I told him, I don't know why this class is so hard for me or why my work isn't good enough for you. If like I've put in the work, I've stayed up like sleepless nights sometimes just to try to like make sure that my papers are good enough, and it just seems like I'm hitting a wall. Like no matter what I do, it's just not enough. Like I asked him, is it because maybe you don't know me enough? Is it because I don't come to office hours enough? We don't get that human interaction, or like like what is going on? And eventually, he gave me just extra work, and which I thought was a little, I still don't know how to feel about it, but he eventually gave me work and worked with me, and I passed the class because I knew I was otherwise going to fail it. And turns out I passed it. Turns out I ended up scraping by at the end. But for a second there, I was like, okay, I'm gonna have to come to terms with the fact that I will fail Spanish in college. Like it is hard to do during COVID.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that you mentioned is that disconnect, and just COVID exacerbating that. It's like he's already disconnected from who you are, like your background, how you practice and write in Spanish, and for this to not have that like interaction with you, yeah, I definitely see that, and I do think that it like reshifts like priorities and stuff. So yeah, I really like that viewpoint that you brought. Mm.
Thank you.
In terms of, I guess, preparation, what did you do to prepare for the unknown? I know you talked about some of the like precautions in terms of like hygiene, cleanliness, stuff like that, to avoid just catching COVID. Were there any other preparations that you had?
Yeah, I think this is going to sound a little bit morbid, but in a pandemic that is killing off a good amount of people, and you see the scarcity of like ventilators, hospital beds. I think I've had to mentally prepare for people that I cared about to catch COVID, even if they didn't. And I think this can be somewhat of a trauma response based off of my identity and, having to live as a minority and living as a woman. But I think that I had to do a lot of the mental work to think like, okay, like in case my best friends catch COVID, in case this person that I care about catches COVID, I'm going to have to be ready for that.
Yeah.
Like I'm going to have to be ready for the people that I care about to suddenly fall ill because there's no chances at like, I guess what I'm trying to say is I had to prepare myself for that in case it did happen, because I'd rather do prepare than to be unprepared.
Yeah.
And that's gonna sound so bad, but I knew that if I got myself, or if I started the process of getting myself mentally ready, it would hurt less hearing it from my friends. Which I think a lot of people had to do during COVID, and it's definitely taken a toll. Um, Other than that, I think saving up money has always been one too, just in case, because like say I would have been diagnosed with COVID, I would not be able to afford a ventilator whatsoever. But maybe, putting myself in a better financial situation could help me, afford resources that would help me get through it if I could, and it's also then again mentally preparing myself, like, and if I get it, I'll have to be okay with like either dying or surviving with long-term health defects. So yeah, I
Yeah.
hope that kind of answered.
No, definitely. I think a lot of times preparation is viewed more so like, especially in the beginning of, at the onset of the pandemic, it was viewed as, the amount of like supplies, like tangible supplies that people were getting. There was just a hyper focus on that. So I think it's really interesting that a lot of your focus was on like mental preparation. So I really, yeah,
Yeah, I think one of the interesting things about this pandemic was that it's had to force like people with a better socioeconomic background to live with stressful conditions that low income folks have already lived through for a really long time. And I think that, that initial shock for them of like, oh, I'm not going to be able to like have access to this anymore.
yeah,
I'm going to have to buy a lot of it. Um, Whereas like me being low income, I'm like, I know what it's like to live with such little resources and access to them and still be all right, that I had to focus on that mental before I did the physical. Yeah, but that's interesting. I didn't even consider that until you pointed that out. Thank you.
definitely like the just being used to scarcity. Yeah, I think that's something that isn't talked about too much. So I appreciate that. And now we're gonna move on to a little bit more on like the daily impacts of COVID on you. So one of the first questions I have regarding this is, how has COVID-19 impacted your daily experiences? First, we can talk about it. We'll talk about it in three different ways. The first one is gender identity. So how has COVID-19 impacted your daily experiences in terms of your gender identity?
Yeah. So I think I roughly brushed on it and mentioned that I labeled myself as a woman, but I say that because when the public sees me, I'm very like I come across as just a woman, but my gender identity is actually very fluid, and I've come to find that I'm actually non-binary, um, which has been an interesting thing to navigate before and after COVID, because wearing my mask, and if I were to just so happen to choose an outfit that's a little bit more on like the feminine side aspect of my identity rather than the masculine, or even wandering those like binaries and stuff like that, I definitely get harassed by men more, simply because I'm woman presenting, um, which has been very weird to acknowledge, because then when I try to like explain to them like, well, no, I'm actually not a woman, they like look at my body and they're just like, but aren't you so clearly? And I'm just like, well, no. And you can't really pull down your mask to tell someone like, hey, actually, and I don't really like to talk to people, and we should even be 6 feet away from each other in the stores. But I think and this has been more of an issue with men than it has been with women, but like approaching me when I clearly don't want to be approached, even during a deadly pandemic, has been insightful, to say the least, on my safety. I think that I was expecting COVID to kind of, and I think this is a reality for like a lot of people that are women presenting, is being sexually harassed in the stores, or being followed on your way to your car from the grocery shop, and little things like that, that I assumed would have stopped when COVID started, because I was like, you're wearing your mask, people can't really see you. Um, and then, I can have like a way different experience if I just like have a different day and decide, okay, today I don't really want to put that much effort. I'm just going to put on a hoodie and some sweats and go to the grocery store, if I put my hoodie over my hair and hide everything, I don't get bothered at all. I don't get bothered at all. And I think it's because of the sexualization for people that are women presenting, whereas like men kind of like give each other space in some areas, at least like that. You know, I don't think that all men are safe from sexual assault whatsoever. That's not what I meant. But I think that in terms of harassment like that, men can fly by a little easier. Yeah. And it's been way more apparent since COVID.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, that was kind of long.
No, you touched on a lot of great points. I especially liked the point of the mask, how like despite like common themes of like, you know, covering up and like stuff, like different like things that are just ingrained into people's idea of what it means to like avoid of what precautions need to be taken in order to like avoid that type of experiences. And even like when like a mask that's covering your face like doesn't do anything to that, it just speaks a lot to that. So I think that was a very insightful answer. And I guess moving on to the next one, with Latinidad, how has COVID impacted your daily experiences in that regards? Whether it's like actual interactions or just contemplations of like your relationship to that part of your identity?
I think it's been a little bit of both, but I can definitely see it more for contemplations. Mm-hmm. I've come to realize that, you know, Latinidad is kind of, I don't want to say a myth, but it's also a little bit like a social construct, huh?
Sorry to interrupt, but can briefly your background, ethnic background. Sorry, I forgot to mention that, but yeah.
No, you're doing amazing. I forgot to introduce that part of myself. So I'm undocumented, or rather documented. I was born in Distrito Federal, Mexico, which is Mexico City now, I think it's called, is the capital of Mexico. I was born there and I was brought over in 2004. So I was relatively young. I was a toddler about. And yeah, that's kind of where my cultural background is. I had to come to the US and like learn English and all of that. And I'm Mexican, but I've had people ask me if I'm mixed with Asian for some reason, which I don't know why they would get that. But yeah, that's kind of my cultural background. I think during COVID, it's definitely made me have a lot of contemplations and overthinking my placement in the US, because due to COVID, everybody got like kind of like in a sense a travel ban, right? Yeah. Where like, you know, people couldn't really leave the country. Some people did regardless, which was super irresponsible, and I wouldn't condone it whatsoever. But as someone that's undocumented, right? I haven't really had that like access to resources or that leisure to do that anyway. So to me, in a sense, it didn't have that much of an impact when it came to that. But I did see a lot of people from high school go to Mexico and then try to like emphasize that nationality. And it's definitely like made me a little bit bitter because I think that Latinidad, to some way, shape, or form, it's kind of a social construct, right? In the sense that it could be very fluid and it could be distinguishable based on the community of said state or said nation in Latin America. Like being from El Salvador will look completely different than being from Mexico. And I think to generalize the Latinx identity to just Latinidad, it's kind of like, I don't want to say a shortcut, but it's kind of, that's kind of what it comes across to me as, because I think Latin America should be looked at with an intersectional type of lens, because there's a lot of things that actually go wrong. Like I think the way that Mexico treats their Central American immigrants should be talked about. And maybe that's because of their proximity to the US and US imperialism in Mexico. But I think that Latinx experience is completely different from being Central American and having that Latinx experience.
Yeah.
And so I've had to contemplate that and sit with that for a while. So that's still even changing. So that's why I was like, I'm sorry if it's.
Yeah, it's definitely like a domino effect, like that, like travel ban, or that essentially what it was, like a pause on travel, just
Yeah.
has an impact on the way in which you're able to reflect on your experiences. So definitely, definitely helpful. And I know you touched on this a little bit with your previous answer, but how has it impacted your daily experiences in relation to U.S. nationalism? I yeah.
Yeah. I think it's definitely. Huh?
Like your with your classification in relation to U.S. nationalism. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's actually really interesting because I don't think that it's really changed a lot, but rather reaffirmed a
Yeah.
lot. Um, I think that as an ethnic studies major, which I should have mentioned previously, and also being undocumented and living through my experience, I was very much so detached from the US, even though this is the place that I live and this is the place that I've, had to like settle down and seek education. It's in my head, it's definitely like when people say, that's not my president, like, I've always been like, well, this ain't my country. Like this really isn't my country. But how the US has handled the pandemic thus far and even the stimulus packages that they've given us, which I might add is the bare minimum in my perspective from a government that like prides itself in its power, and has access to this many resources and this many connections to multiple countries. I think that I was just expecting the US to care more about their citizens, and not even to mention that like it was during the pandemic that all the racial tension did get hiked up, and I think the government's lack of response to a whole minority community, and even it came across as greedy. That's what I'll say, because the US very much so spends a lot of their budget on the military, which I felt like could have been used for citizenship assistance. Um, and even non-citizenship, right? Because I'm not documented as a citizen, so I don't get access to food stamps or anything like that. But I think I was just expecting more, and it was disappointing. Although I've studied U.S. history, I knew that there wouldn't be that many access to resources, but I was just hoping, in a sense, that we were at a better place as a society.
Yeah, for sure.
It's kind of hard to be,
Yeah.
nationalistically proud.
And I know you touched a little bit on your status with DACA. So I have a few questions regarding that. And I know some of these you kind of already touched on. If you want to elaborate or keep the answer shorter because you already touched on it, feel free to do so. There's a lot of questions that we have to go through. So whatever you feel is fine. So yeah, the main overarching question in terms of your DACA status is how would you describe your overall experience as an undocumented / documented Latinx person in the U.S.? For example, some of the biggest obstacles as an undocumented / documented person, how it's evolved over this since the start of the pandemic. And I could ask a few more follow-ups after that. But yeah.
Yeah, no worries. I think this has kind of already been an experience, as I've mentioned, of always having to work, always having to be prepared for the unexpected, right? But I think being undocumented has been such a struggle because of a lack of federal and state aid and resources. Not only that, but I think the interesting thing about being DACA-mented is that it puts you in a limbo where you're not fully a citizen, but you're also not fully undocumented. So in some areas, like I got a stimulus check, I did. So I'm not going to be hypocritical about that. But on the other hand, I don't have and haven't had access to CalFresh, food stamps, unemployment. It's been difficult having to solely rely on yourself.
Yeah.
And I know that that's specifically an experience that I travel alone because, I don't really have a connection to my parents. So I'm an independent, undocumented student at Cal, meaning that I rely solely financially, physically, mentally, emotionally, solely on myself. And I've definitely seen the bigger toll that it has taken through COVID. I think that I've had definitely an increase in hours of responsibility. So even though I was independent prior to the pandemic, having to live with the stress of the pandemic and, any what ifs, right? So like, what if my car were to break down? What if, like I have a health defect, having um, no backup plan to rely on that's not just me has been extremely stressful. But it's also so fitting, I guess, I've rather have always kind of been prepared in some way, shape, or form, because this is my identity. And, I have financial issues and, lack of federal and state resources has always been a thing growing up. I think I just have become more aware of it now that I'm getting more educated and I'm in spaces and, speaking to people that do have those resources and access to those resources. I've definitely seen the difference, right? From like me having to work extra hours and my friends being able to take a break here and there because they have food stamps. So food isn't something that is as worrisome for them. Whereas like, I've had cases where, my check doesn't come for another week and I've had to eat cheese eggs for the entire week, little things like that have evolved so much more stressfully since the pandemic. And I think I kind of touched on one another maybe another question that you asked me, but yeah, I've definitely seen the difference amongst my friends who have citizenship status.
Yeah.
And even though they are low income too, and we are even at the same institution, they only work one job.
Also share the Latinx identity?
Yeah. No, so I was about to say their name, but I have this really good friend, and he's from Orange County. And he is Latinx, first gen, low income, but he does have access to CalFresh, and he does receive the Pell Grant, and he does receive resources from Cal, certain scholarships that FAFSA tends to reserve solely for citizens. And I see it in the way that we spend money differently, and our worries behind spending the money and the amount of jobs we work and the amount of hours we work.
Yeah.
So keeping their information confidential, they work about, I want to say 10 hours to 12 hours a week, working one job, right? And I'm currently working two jobs 16 hours a week for one and 18 hours a week for the other. So put that together, that is about 34 hours per week. And I work that every week. So none of my days are really any rest days. Even the weekends, because I have papers and I have projects that I need to, make up for. Whereas, if I had that like CalFresh, if I had those food stamps, I probably wouldn't work as much because spending money on food wouldn't be such a big worry.
Yeah. And I think that speaks a lot to a point you touched on earlier, just how varying the Latinx experiences are within like different Latin American countries, but also domestically here in the US. They just vary significantly based on status, based on a variety of other factors. So I really appreciate that.
Right. And this is also not considering like the fact that him and I are both white passing, which comes from obviously imperialism and colonialism, but also our Latinx experience would look different if we were brown, and that's something to be said. Yeah, sorry, I just didn't mean to interrupt. I just felt like including that.
Yeah, that's just like another layer on top of, the varying experiences. So I definitely contributed to that. And I guess moving on, I know we've touched a lot on different aspects of your identity. So if you want to touch more or less on some of these questions, feel free to do so. But I guess the overarching question is, how have different aspects of your identity revealed themselves since the start of the pandemic? What became more noticeable to you? What became more noticeable to the public? If there is anything
I think a little bit of, I talked a little bit about my gender identity, but a little bit of my sexual identity. So I'm pansexual. And I think that didn't resurface as much prior to COVID. Maybe because I was in a committed relationship previously, or maybe just because COVID has kind of forced me to sit home and sit with myself, even when I'm not working, right? Which is, you would think it's such a little time with the amount of responsibilities that I have, but I overthink a lot. And my sexual identity has been something that I've noticed has been more of my preference as of lately, rather than previously to COVID, I was in a very heteronormative relationship. And I think exploring that part of like my identity and sexuality definitely has resurfaced more during COVID. But yeah, I think that's about it. I think I touched on it previously.
Yeah, no, that's very insightful. And I just, that gets me thinking to the way, just the way in which a reflection of the reflection during this time just reveals a lot more. Like you just have to think back about things that maybe you didn't have the chance before, whether that's good or bad. It definitely happens. I guess, did anything become more noticeable to the general public? I know you touched a little bit on gender identity. If not, that's also okay. But yeah, just want to give that opportunity to touch on that if there's anything. If not, we can move on to the next question.
I'm trying to think. I don't think too much to the public besides my gender identity, which I kind of already touched on, just because I don't really like go around stating to people like I'm pansexual and stuff like that. Otherwise, I think it's not really noticeable, just because like I said, I'm very woman presenting sometimes, and people would just, I think, assume that I'm straight.
Yeah, those assumptions, they just carry through. And the next few questions have a little bit more to do with support. I know you mentioned previously how employment was able to provide some sort of relief through through allowing a work to continue online. But what support systems were in place for you however you define that to be.
Yeah.
What support systems did you have to create for yourself?
Yeah, I think that the very few support systems that are at Cal, like the Undocumented Students program, which opened up their emergency grants, was very, very helpful at the time. I think it's, if anything, it really showed me the way in which undocumented students have to struggle with a lack of federal and state funding, but can always fall back on their community. Because every single time I've been in a financial strain, I've always had undocumented folks have my back way before any citizen would. And this is not to say that my citizen friends wouldn't be there for me. This is just to say my undocumented community shows up for me in a different manner. And I think that that's something to be said because, it brings a different sense of community and sense of safety because it is people that live with your similar background experience and they understand you in a different manner than a citizen would. I feel like sometimes when I've vented to my citizen friends, it just kind of has had the energy of like, well, you can work your way out of it, or you can, persevere through. And I don't think they realize that in order for a person to persevere is they have to have access, they have to have motivation, they have to feel safe. And I think my undocumented community has done that for me a lot and has also taught me how to do that for myself. So what was actually interesting is that I went through homelessness twice during COVID. One for a moving reason, and then second due to abuse from a heteronormative relationship. And my undocumented friends have always been there for me. It'll always be my first gen low income minority students that will be there for me. But the way that undocumented folks show up is just a little different. Like, I think that first gen low income students would still be there for me. A lot of my friends were like, if you need food, if you want me to take you out, like I definitely can do that. Whereas and this is not to like put them in competition or any way, shape, or form. I appreciate all the support that I receive. But my undocumented friends have been like, oh, you're homeless? You're staying with me today. You have a roof over your head tonight. Please do not sleep in your car. And I think that speaks to the way in which undocumented folks show up for themselves. And even though we're not technically a system of support, it is my support system, if that makes any sense. I think that sounded a little a little redundant at the end, but
no. And would you say that the undocumented support system is one you think of at least a little bit more than like the Latinx support system?
Yeah, unfortunately, I do. I think that I've considered it in my head more reliable and more consistent. I feel like I've had some first gen low income Latinx friends that have like helped me out and then kind of like thrown it in my face later, which I feel like can be different in situation to situation. But I think that with my undocumented friends, I just feel a lot more comfortable and like I'm more able and willing to reach out for help than if it's just my first gen low income Latinx friends. Because I feel like at the back of my head, they're still kind of judging me in terms of like, oh, you're homeless because you're not working enough. Or kind of like, even though they might not say it, I think that it's at the back of my head where I think like, oh, they're judging me for the ways in which I have to currently live. Whereas if I tell someone that's undocumented, this is what I've had to live through, they're like, oh, I've been there, or oh, I totally get it. Like, you have a place to stay. Please let me know if there's any way that I can support you. Whereas like a a Latinx friend that's just low income and first gen will be like, well, you can stay with me maybe for a couple nights. I'm not really sure. Like, my parents, are kind of like nervous about it. Whereas like my undocumented friends have been like, nope, I'll speak to my parents. Like, you're fine. Like, you'll be okay. You know what I mean? I think it's undocumented people just have a different sense of understanding in terms of like the gravity of things and how we deal with them because we've been there and done that. And I think that this isn't to bash or make it my first and low income Latinx friends anything less than. I think they just don't have that sense of understanding.
Yeah, yeah. And
yeah.
I think that's fair to just point out and acknowledge because it has impacted your experiences. So I think that is a very fair point. And so thank you for that. Moving on to a little bit more about finances. I know you mentioned initially the ways in which COVID has impacted your workflow and finances and budgeting. So we don't have to retouch on that, but has that changed throughout the course of the pandemic? I know you mentioned that you have 2 jobs and work over 30 hours a week. So has there been any major changes in terms of your workflow?
Yeah, it's definitely increased. Having my first upper class year, like being a junior, and I think they say this is the hardest year for both high school and college. I've definitely had an increase in hours to try to make up for all the times that I do focus on my academics, just so that I'm financially stable enough to not only live, because I'm in a sense tired of being on survival mode, right? Not only to live, but to be able to buy the things I want, or just being able to give myself a little piece of like, I think that a lot of undocumented folks, or at least this is my experience growing up undocumented, we weren't, as kids, we weren't allowed to have or to buy toys and the luxury of things like that. And I think part of healing my inner child has been building the financial stability enough to say, like, if I go to Target and I want to buy some candles, I have this strange candle addiction, that if I want to go and buy some candles, I can have the financial stability to buy all 5 candles if I wanted to. Whereas that wasn't a thing when I was a child. Yeah, so I would say that.
And I know you mentioned previously the emphasis on surviving that COVID has placed on people. Would you say that kind of pushed you over the edge in terms of like realizing that you're tired of just surviving and like wanting to just, as you said, heal that inner child? Yeah.
I think finances kind of the lack of finances or financial security or financial literacy, I would say, kind of forces you to live on survival. And although me working 2 jobs could be seen as me working, living for survival, I think it's a little different just because I want to build that stability for myself. Yeah,
definitely. So moving on, we have a few questions left.
No worries.
Yeah. I know you touched on education briefly. Were there any I know you mentioned some of the like changes that impacted your education as a result of COVID. Was there anything that was, actually you may have already touched on it, but was there anything that was like particularly beneficial or detrimental to your ability to perform well? If you want, you could just highlight something you've already said.
I think I've already highlighted on a lot of the detriments.
Yeah.
I think one thing that was a positive is that it forced me to overwork myself. And that sounds negative when you think about it, when you first hear it. But it's also made me realize what I'm capable of. And the fact that I am capable of, even though I struggled through that Spanish class, excelling academically, passing my classes, avoiding, you know, academic probation, despite being in a pandemic. This isn't to shame anyone who has gone through those experiences. This is to say that my anxiety and the anxiety that I experienced from being undocumented and being a student during COVID, they have forced me to overwork myself. But that has came in positive opportunities. Like recently, I was just admitted to the Fireball Scholars Program at UC Berkeley. And that means that it's a research opportunity and I get to focus on research over the course of an academic year, my last year at Berkeley. So I'm really excited. And in that sense, COVID kind of pushed me in a positive direction. But other than that, I would say it's more detrimental.
Yeah, for sure. And congrats on that, by the way. That's an amazing accomplishment. And in terms of, so that was a little bit on education. In terms of health, I know you mentioned briefly ways you managed to take care of yourself, both physically and mentally. Is there anything you do like on a daily basis or like have done occasionally that has been really impactful that you didn't do before the pandemic?
Yeah, I think that previously, right before the pandemic, I had stopped going to therapy because I just had gotten used to the rhythm of like going to school, being on campus, and one, being busy physically, and two, I felt like I was in a stable place a little bit prior to COVID. And, COVID happening the way that it happened, it's definitely forced me to seek out help again because it is such a toll on my physical, mental, and emotional well-being. It's just kind of like taking that from me. And I think it's also manifested in health issues sometimes. For the general part, I'm mostly okay, but being diagnosed with anxiety, like legitimately, previously to COVID, and having my my therapist tell me how severe it actually is after meeting me, I think that changed because of COVID. I think I got a lot more anxiety than I had previously. And sometimes it'll manifest itself in like stomach issues or, appetite issues. Sometimes I'm so anxious that it's hard for me to eat, which is a problem in itself. And I think I've seen it be evident a lot more since COVID, unfortunately. But I have been journaling for my mental health, and it's been helping a lot more. I've been trying to fit in snacks here and there. Like I'll take little pretzel chips to work and take some hummus packets, little things like that that I've tried to incorporate to take care of myself, because I noticed that I was letting the pandemic and I was letting academics kind of take over my physical and mental health. And so that's kind of what I've been doing to try to take care of myself.
Yeah, they definitely intertwine physical and mental. So
yeah, it's all interconnected, and I think that that's what makes these questions so hard. I'm so sorry if like I've gone on tangents. It's just I want to include as much detail as possible.
No, yeah, I like that you actually highlighted how they intertwine. I think a lot of times they're just viewed as very like separate experiences. You either take care of one or the other. So I definitely like
that. Like some people will be like, I'm taking a break from my mental health to focus on school. I'm like, I thought that.
And I guess lastly, in your opinion, how has the Latinx experience or your perception of the Latinx experience shifted throughout the pandemic? I know you touched a bit on the differences in the Latinx experience that you were able to note, but has there been any shifts in overall perception, either from the public or your own perception of the Latinx experience?
I think a little bit of both. I think that I was, as an ethnic studies major, I was kind of already on track in terms of questioning the Latinx experience, and like what that meant for me, because, you know, I feel like Latinidad is such an interesting topic, because depending on citizenship or not citizenship, you're treated so differently. Depending on skin color or not, you're treated differently. I know this is kind of like part of the Latinx diaspora, but like how well you speak Spanish could be seen as differently, and that's such an interesting thing to navigate, because depending on different regions and different states and different nation states, you know, people have different accents, people have different lingos, and what's the right word that I'm thinking of, kind of like different ways in which they speak. I think it's kind of more related to the mannerisms and the way in which words have different meanings for like different places. I think we call different things like a pencil sharpener. In Spanish, in Mexico, it would be called the sacapuntas, but I think Central Americans call it something else. Or the way that people say bro, like in Mexico they would say güey, where I'm from, but in, I think, El Salvador they would say like vos, or stuff like that, you know. Or Guatemala, I think they say something else too. And I think, sorry, I'm trying to put it together. I think COVID has definitely made an emphasis on those, because as I've had to stay home, I've kind of been more involved with my region of speaking, the way in which we communicate, and it's been different for different folks. But other than that, I think it's just really affirmed the things that I've already kind of been on track about. One of my biggest things right now is recognizing my placement as a person that is white passing, or, you know, not even dropping the white passing, is simply just white, because, you know, if living in America, like that is such a survival or death difference for us. And I think that, you know, kind of stepping out of that white fragility, right? Of being like, oh, I'm undocumented, I'm a minority. I think a lot of my first gen low income Latinx peeps kind of mistake the fact that they're oppressed with that experience. Like I've had a lot of friends say that they were brown, and I'm like, sweetie, I have to break it to you, but you're beige. And I think it's very easy to kind of try to identify as that, because the K through 12 system has done a really simple job of educating, where that's not really acknowledged, or rather the fetishization of light skin and being admired for having light skin has been part of the Latinx experience. And it's one of those things that's a little taboo. But other than that, I think the pandemic COVID has just reaffirmed all my doubts, and kind of made me question a little bit more and try to figure that out. I'm not going to try to continue, because I've been going off on a tangent a little bit, but I think that's about it.
Oh yeah, definitely. And it was a very particular way in which these affirmations came about. But it's interesting to see how they played out in your own personal experiences. And in terms of the questions, I don't have any other questions prepared. But is there anything that you would like to share that we did not discuss yet?
One of the things that's also interesting, I think I said brown only, but there could also be Black undocumented people, and I think they're kind of seen as like taboo, or like their experience isn't really talked about. And I think that it should be acknowledged for existing, even though that seems very bare minimum. I think that their experience should be put at the forefront because they are the most affected. In terms of the undocumented community, I think that had I been brown, my experience would be completely different as someone that's woman presenting. I think that's just about it. And also there's also indigenous undocumented folks too. Like being undocumented and also just even being Latinx too can be like such an intersectional an intersectional concept. And I feel like that should just be stated. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. And I definitely agree in terms of touching on the experiences of Black undocumented voices, especially because of the intersection with just being in the US and like criminalization of Black people, how that leads to, how that serves as a gateway towards like deportation, and the invisibility behind it all. Like one of the themes that I really like that you touch on is like the invisibility of certain identities. You know, being undocumented is already like an identity that like causes, like contributes to some level of invisibility. So that's definitely, there's tiers to it and there's levels to it. But yeah, so this was really a really insightful and really impactful interview. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day to do this. This will really contribute to how people understand the Latinx experience in the United States. And I'm sure it's going to be a great reference at the UT Austin Library for their project on this. So thank you for doing that. I think unless there's anything else that you would like to say, we can wrap it up. Once again, very insightful. Thank you a lot. And I hope you have a great rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It was such a pleasure to be interviewed by you. Thank you for making me feel comfortable enough to share all of this information. I really appreciate it. And other than that, I hope you have a great day too.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm gonna